I mean, obviously you're going to find a lot of folk art here. You're going to find maybe some Coca-Cola items more here because Coke was from the South in Atlanta, and there's things that are regional, but you're right about the history because Southerners hold on to their history more than anybody, man.
American Pickers was built around a simple idea. Two friends driving across America, digging through dusty garages, and somehow finding treasure where everyone else saw junk. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz became the heart of that formula, and their chemistry made the show feel less like a job and more like a road trip between old friends. Then Frank disappeared from the screen, and the story took a turn nobody watching could have expected. So what really happened between Mike and Frank, and how did their story end? Join us as we uncover what happened between Mike and Frank and how it changed American Pickers. The show nobody expected to work. For 5 years, Mike Wolfe tried to convince television networks that there was a show hiding inside the world of antique picking. And for those 5 years, they told him no. Mike already knew the world he wanted to show. He had opened antique archaeology in LeClaire, Iowa, and spent years traveling across the country looking for forgotten objects in barns, garages, and old buildings. He even filmed his own picking trips on a mini DV camera balanced on the dashboard of his van. To Mike, the real story was never just about the objects. It was about the people who owned them. Every stop created the same quiet tension. Mike wanted something the owner had spent years holding on to, and the owner had to decide whether they were finally ready to let it go. Mike believed that simple exchange could keep an audience watching, but the networks disagreed. One after another, major networks passed on the idea. Mike kept going anyway. Then, in 2009, the History Channel finally gave him a chance. Even that opportunity came at a time when the network was seeing success with Pawn Stars and was becoming more interested in shows built around unusual objects and the people who found them. On January 18, 2010, American Pickers premiered, and it was a success. It drew 3.1 million viewers that night, making it the network's highest-rated premiere since 2007. The man who had spent 5 years being told that nobody wanted to watch antique picking had suddenly proved them wrong. And he wasn't doing it alone. Frank Fritz had been there from the beginning. He wasn't just a co-star brought in to create chemistry for television. Frank had known Mike since 8th grade. By the time cameras started following them, the two had already been friends for more than 40 years. They also had different strengths. Frank had an eye for toys, oil cans, advertising pieces, and other collectibles. Mike was drawn to motorcycles, bicycles, signs, and anything with a story behind it. That difference helped make the show work. On screen, Mike and Frank seemed completely natural. They joked, argued over prices, chased leads, and walked into forgotten places together as if the cameras weren't even there. The friendship felt effortless because, for the most part, it was. But that was also what made what came later so complicated. The audience wasn't watching two strangers become friends for television. They were watching two men bring decades of history into a business that suddenly involved cameras, producers, travel, schedules, money, and millions of viewers. The same friendship that made American Pickers feel authentic would eventually become part of one of the show's most difficult stories. So, what happens when a friendship that survived for decades has to survive something completely different? Fame? The chemistry? And the pressure. The reason American Pickers worked so well was simple. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz never had to pretend to be friends. They already were, and for a very long time at that. Mike was the visionary. He could walk into a crowded barn and notice something everyone else had ignored. a rusted motorcycle, an old sign, a forgotten piece of advertising. He could see the history and value hiding underneath the dirt. More importantly, he knew how to connect with the people who owned those objects. Even when he was negotiating over a price, he could make sellers feel like he understood why the item mattered to them. Frank, on the other hand, brought something different. He was the natural counterweight to Mike. His humor came quickly and without effort. He was comfortable sitting quietly when there was nothing to say. But he could also walk into a stranger's home and have them laughing within minutes. Where Mike often focused on the story behind an object, Frank had a way of making the people around him feel comfortable. That balance became the heart of the show. But television only showed the moments that made the relationship look easy. It didn't show what happened between those moments. For more than a decade, Mike and Frank spent enormous amounts of time together. But they weren't simply working together. They were spending a huge part of their lives inside the same space. A friend of Frank's later told the Quad City Times that working that closely with someone for so long can put almost any relationship under pressure. Even the strongest friendships can begin to crack when there is no real distance between the people involved. And the pressure wasn't only coming from the job. Frank had also been living with Crohn's disease for decades. The condition brought its own daily challenges, made more difficult by constant travel, physical work, and the demands of filming. He still had to climb through old buildings, search through dusty spaces, lift objects, travel for hours, and remain engaged in front of a camera. Viewers rarely saw that side of him. Frank didn't make his health the center of his story. Instead, he continued showing up and doing the job, even when his body made it harder. Behind the scenes, however, the relationship between the two men was changing. The tensions that would later become public were already building during the show's later years. Yet while American Pickers remained successful, neither Mike nor Frank openly explained what was happening between them. Then, in March 2020, Frank disappeared from the show. There was no clear answer about what had happened between the two friends who had spent years traveling the country together. For the audience, only one thing was suddenly obvious. Frank had simply vanished. Behind the scenes, however, he was fighting battles that had nothing to do with television. The firing nobody announced. The back surgery came first, and it was serious enough to change almost everything about Frank Fritz's life. He underwent a procedure that left him with 2 rods in his spine and 185 stitches, followed by months of recovery that made a quick return to the physical demands of American Pickers almost impossible. The job required constant physical engagement, and it wasn't going to be easy while recovering from major spinal surgery. At the same time, Frank was trying to deal with another problem that had followed him for years. He checked into rehab to address his alcohol use, stopped drinking, and began focusing heavily on exercise and his overall health. During that period, he lost more than 65 pounds, giving viewers who eventually saw him again a very different picture of the man who had once spent years traveling from one roadside find to another. But while Frank was recovering, something else was happening that had nothing to do with his health. His relationship with Mike Wolfe was falling apart. By the time Frank finally spoke publicly in a 2021 interview with The Sun, he said the two men had not spoken in 2 years. That detail was especially striking because Mike and Frank had spent decades knowing each other, with more than 10 years of that friendship playing out in front of television cameras. Frank was also clear about his position on the show. He said he had not quit American Pickers, that he had been focused on recovering, and that he still wanted to return. In his view, whether that happened was ultimately a decision for the History Channel. Then, in July 2021, the network made that decision official. Frank Fritz would not be returning to American Pickers. Mike responded with a public statement on Instagram that appeared warm and supportive. He spoke about their long history together and wished Frank well, presenting the situation in a way that suggested respect remained between them despite everything that had happened. Frank, however, read the statement very differently. He told reporters that he believed someone else had written it for Mike, and then offered a remark that revealed just how damaged their relationship had become. After roughly 10 years of working together on television, Frank said he genuinely could not remember Mike saying 5 kind things to him without being prompted. That accusation changed the story for many viewers because the friendship they had watched for years suddenly looked very different from the relationship Frank was describing. Public sympathy began shifting strongly toward Frank, especially because his version of events presented him as someone who had been dealing with major health problems, working through sobriety, and hoping to return, only to discover that the decision had already been made without him. Mike, meanwhile, remained on the show. Every new episode without Frank reminded fans of the friendship that was no longer there, and fans began looking at everything that followed through the growing divide between the two men. But the public fallout was only beginning. Because the story behind Frank's disappearance was about to become far more complicated than either side had initially revealed. That downward spiral. In July 2022, the story between Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz suddenly stopped being about television, contracts, or their years-long feud, and became something much more serious. Frank had suffered a stroke, and it was bad. Mike was the one who shared the news publicly on Instagram, and the message immediately changed the tone surrounding their relationship. After months of arguments, accusations, and questions about what had really happened between the two former co-stars, Mike put all of that aside. He acknowledged that there had been plenty of opinions about their friendship and the show, but said none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was Frank, and Mike urged people to pray for his friend, making it clear that he still loved him and hoped he would survive. The reality Frank was facing, however, was devastating. The stroke left him in a wheelchair and unable to live independently, meaning he required full-time care. His medical and living expenses reportedly reached around $23,000 a month, creating financial problems serious enough that a court eventually appointed a temporary guardian and financial conservator to help manage his affairs. Behind those numbers was a much larger health battle. Frank's death certificate would later list cerebrovascular disease as the cause of the stroke, while also identifying aortic stenosis and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These conditions had been developing beneath the surface, while Frank was still traveling around the country and appearing on television as the energetic picker audiences had known for years. The stroke also changed how people viewed the feud. During the firing controversy, much of the public anger had been directed toward Mike. But Frank's condition forced viewers to look beyond the arguments and remember what had existed before American Pickers ever became a television show. As Frank recovered, questions began circulating about whether Mike had visited him and how involved he had been in his life. Mike's girlfriend, Letitia Klein, eventually addressed those rumors on Instagram, pushing back against claims that Mike had simply stayed away. Still, the full truth about what happened between Mike and Frank during those months remained private. Then something happened that nobody watching the story from the outside could have predicted. The two men eventually saw each other again, and when the details of that meeting became known, it revealed a side of their relationship that television had never shown. But if their relationship was never truly a feud, what happened when they finally came face to face again? The reunion they both cried through. A mutual friend eventually became the person who brought Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz back into the same room. Over Memorial Day weekend in 2023, she arranged a reunion between the two men and later spoke to the Quad City Times about what had happened. She pushed back against the idea that their relationship had simply become a television feud. In her view, it had never been that simple. Mike and Frank had spent more than a decade working side by side, often for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, with almost no room to step away from the pressure of work or from each other. Frank had wanted to see Mike for some time, but he needed to reach a point where he was ready for the meeting. And eventually, he was. When they finally sat together, Mike told Frank something that went straight to the heart of what had made American Pickers work in the first place. Nobody could replace him. Frank had a personality that could not simply be recreated with another co-star, and that was part of what had made their partnership so unique. The reunion became emotional for both men. They cried together and started remembering the years before everything had gone wrong, including their first appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman in 2011. For two guys from Iowa who had spent years driving around in a van looking for forgotten treasures, standing on that stage had once felt almost impossible to believe. Now, they were sitting together again, with years of hurt between them and Frank's health severely limiting what he could do. Mike was already thinking about what came next. He wanted to find some way to bring Frank back in front of a camera, even if his condition meant the role had to be much smaller than before. It wasn't necessarily about recreating the old show. It was about giving Frank a chance to be part of the world they had built together one more time. Unfortunately, that opportunity never came. On September 30th, 2024, Frank Fritz died at the age of 60, and Mike was right there with him. He had arrived at Frank's bedside roughly an hour before his death and stayed with him as his final moments approached. Mike held Frank's hand and rubbed his chest as he took his last breath. Frank's mother's best friend and Mike's own mother were also in the room at that tragic moment. The official cause of death was listed as cerebral infarction and the long-term consequences of the stroke he had suffered 2 years earlier. After everything that had happened between the two friends, Frank's story had ended with Mike beside him. When Mike announced Frank's death on Instagram, his words carried the weight of someone who had known him long before television made either of them famous. He remembered knowing Frank for more than half his life and described the man audiences saw on television as the same person he had known from the beginning. A dreamer who could be both deeply sensitive and genuinely funny. It was a fitting final reflection on a friendship that had survived childhood, fame, success, resentment, illness, and years of silence. Because whatever happened between Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz, their story had never really begun with American Pickers, and it did not end with the show either. What American Pickers became. American Pickers kept going after Frank's firing, and after his stroke, and after his death. Because television keeps going when the network sees a reason to keep it going. Season 26 delivered ratings that told the story of an audience that had not entirely returned after everything that had happened. Though the finale pulled 760,000 viewers, in a way that suggested the core audience was still there, still watching, still willing to give the show another season. Season 27 premiered in 2025 with what the production treated as a fresh start, leaning back into the elements that had worked before everything got complicated. Robbie Wolfe is Mike's road partner now, warm and capable on camera, but carrying a different energy from the dynamic that Frank provided for 14 seasons. Danielle Colby also remains at Antique Archaeology in Iowa. The format Mike spent 5 years pitching still works, but the chemistry that made it feel genuinely irreplaceable was specific to two people who had known each other since 8th grade. And that is not something a production can recreate by finding a good replacement. In September 2025, the story added another blow nobody saw coming. Mike and Letitia Klein were involved in a serious car accident in Columbia, Tennessee, that left Klein with life-threatening injuries she spent months recovering from. Mike closed the Nashville location of Antique Archaeology in April 2025 and launched a new History Channel series, History's Greatest Picks, in February 2026, a format that lets him keep doing the work without the weight of everything the American Picker's name now carries. He is 61 years old and still picking. Frank comes to mind constantly on the road. Mike has said that the properties are full of things that connect back to him, and talking about his death is still not easy. The van is still moving, the barns are still full, and the show that started as a simple idea about two friends finding treasure in forgotten places is still going, carrying everything it has been through in the years since it first told that story. Now that you know Mike was holding Frank's hand when he took his last breath, does that change how you see everything that happened between them? And do you think American Pickers will ever truly feel the same without Frank Fritz beside Mike? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.